A private investigator had just recorded the Jersey Devil and tried to share it with the world. Will Smith was a private investigator living in New Orleans. He had been working in this field for years. Most of his work involved cheating partners or missing people. He had solved many cases and people trusted his instincts. He spent a lot of time online, reading news and strange reports. One day, something caught his attention. It started with a post in an online forum. Someone claimed that people were disappearing from a small village in Mexico. The post was short, but it sounded serious. The person who wrote it said their cousin had gone to that village and never returned. Local police had looked into it but found nothing. The case was closed without answers. Others in the comments said similar things had happened to people they knew. Will didn't ignore it. He had seen enough to know that where there's smoke, there's fire. He began searching for more information. He read every comment, every article, and every rumor he could find. The village had a name, but it was not found on most maps. It was small and deep in the countryside. Even in Spanish forums, people avoided talking about it. Some called it cursed. Others said strange things had happened there for years. Will gathered every clue he could. He found only one old news article in a local Mexican newspaper. It talked about 3 missing farmers. The article ended by saying they were never found. That was the only official source. Everything else came from whispers and stories. But Will trusted his gut. Something strange was happening there. He started to prepare. He knew this trip would not be easy. He bought new gear. He packed light but smart. He brought his camera, a small drone, a voice recorder, a flashlight, and tools for camping. He also made sure to bring notebooks and a map of the area. Even though the village was not marked, he used satellite images to figure out where it might be. He wanted to be ready for anything. Will told no one except one friend where he was going. He didn't want to scare anyone. He also didn't want to cause panic. He booked a flight to Mexico City and made plans to travel south from there. He chose a local hotel for his first night. His plan was simple. Get to the village, look around, ask questions, and record what he could. Before flying out, he spent one last night in his apartment. He sat at his desk and looked at the photos he had found. One showed an empty street with a strange shadow near a wall. Another was a blurry picture of what looked like a creature in the trees. Most people would have called them fake. But Will had learned that sometimes truth hides in poor quality. The morning of the flight, he felt a mix of excitement and fear. He had done many dangerous things in his career. He had been in fights, chased people, and once escaped a burning building. But this was different. This time, he wasn't chasing a person. He was chasing a mystery, one that had no clear start and no clear end. He sat on the plane, looking out the window. The city disappeared behind clouds. He thought about what he might find. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was just stories passed from person to person, growing bigger each time. But if it wasn't, if something real was happening, he had to see it for himself. After the plane landed, he went through customs and collected his bag. The heat outside was sharp and dry. The air smelled different. He took a taxi to the hotel and checked in. That night, he reviewed his notes again. He looked over the map and marked his route. The next day, he would try to reach the village. The story about the missing people had pulled him in. Will didn't know what he would face, but he knew something important was waiting out there. The truth had been hidden too long. He was ready to find it, no matter the risk. Will Smith arrived at the airport in Mexico City. He was tired from the long flight but stayed focused. He had one goal, to reach the strange village where people had disappeared. After collecting his bag, he left the airport and walked outside. The sun was bright, and the air was hot. The city was loud and full of people. Will didn't plan to stay long. He wanted to get to the village as soon as possible. He had written down the name of the village on a piece of paper. It was not on most maps, but he had a general idea of its location. He believed he could get close enough and then walk the rest of the way. Will started looking for a taxi. He asked several drivers if they could take him south. First, they agreed. But when he showed them the name of the village, their faces changed. Some became silent. Others shook their heads and said no. A few even backed away. as if just hearing the name made them scared. Will tried again and again. Every driver refused. Some said it was too far. Some said the road was broken. One man pointed at the paper, crossed himself, and walked away quickly. Will knew fear when he saw it. These people were not just avoiding a long trip. They were afraid of something near that village. But no one would explain. After an hour of trying, Will stopped asking. He realized he would have to get there on foot. He bought water, extra snacks, and a walking stick. Then he found a ride to the nearest town on the edge of the area. It was a quiet place, dusty and small. He got dropped off there and looked at his map again. The village was still far, but now it was possible to walk. Will began his journey just after noon. The sun was high, and the heat was strong. The road soon turned to dirt. There were no signs, no houses, just dry land, a few bushes, and the sound of his boots hitting the ground. Time moved slowly. Hours passed. Sweat dripped from his face, and his shirt clung to his back. He stopped to drink water and rest when he could. He kept walking. There was no turning back. As he walked, the landscape changed. The road became rougher. Trees grew thicker on both sides. The air felt heavier. The wind was quiet. No birds, no animals. Only silence. The deeper he went, the more the world around him felt strange. It was like the land did not want him there. His steps felt louder. The shadows felt longer. Still, he kept going. After 6 long hours, the sun began to set. The sky turned orange and then purple. The village finally came into view. Will stopped and looked ahead. It was not what he expected. There were no lights, no sounds, no people, just small houses made of wood and stone. Some were falling apart. Roofs were broken. Doors hung open. The place looked like no one had lived there for years. He walked into the village slowly. The air was cool now. The ground was dry and cracked. There were no cars, no signs of life, just quiet. He checked a few houses. They were empty. Dust covered everything. Spider webs filled the corners. Time had stopped here. It was like the people had left in a hurry and never came back. Will knew he had to stay the night. He found a clear spot near a small open area and set up his tent. He unpacked his gear and placed his tools around him. The ground was hard, but he made it work. He ate a snack, wrote a few notes, and tried to stay calm. The silence was heavy. Every small sound made him turn his head. He lay inside his tent and looked up at the dark sky. Stars filled the night, but the beauty didn't comfort him. Something felt wrong. The village was too quiet. The air was too still. He felt like he was being watched, but he saw nothing. He tried to sleep, but his thoughts were loud. What had scared everyone away? What had happened to the missing people? Will closed his eyes and took a deep breath. He would need rest. Tomorrow he would explore the village more. For now, all he could do was wait. The night had just begun, and the real mystery was still ahead. Will Smith was sleeping inside his small tent. The air was cold and quiet. The night in the village was dark, and not a single sound came from the empty houses. Will had trouble sleeping, but at some point he had drifted off. Hours passed in silence. Then, suddenly, a growling sound broke the stillness. The sound was deep and low. It was not close, but it was not far either. Will opened his eyes. He lay still for a moment, listening. The growl came again. It was not the wind. It was not the sound of an animal he knew. He slowly unzipped the tent and stepped outside. The sky was filled with stars. A thin mist moved near the ground. Will looked around. At first, he saw nothing strange. Then, at the edge of the open space, he noticed something small. It was a dog. A small, cute dog with shiny fur and bright eyes. It stood still and looked at him. It didn't growl or bark. It just stared. Will was surprised. The village was empty. There had been no signs of life. No people, no animals. Yet here was a clean, friendly-looking dog. It did not make sense. Still, he took a step closer. The dog didn't run. It wagged its tail once and then turned around. Slowly, it began to walk toward the trees. Will followed. He didn't think twice. He grabbed his flashlight and walked behind the dog. The dog moved calmly. kept looking back, making sure Will was still behind it. The forest ahead was dark and full of shadows. The branches swayed slightly in the wind, but no other sound filled the air. They walked for several minutes, maybe 10, maybe 15. Will kept checking his surroundings. He saw broken branches, strange marks on the ground, and claw scratches on tree trunks. The air grew thicker. The deeper they went, the colder it became. Then the dog stopped. It stood in front of a cave. The entrance was wide and dark. The air near it smelled strange, strong and sharp, like rusted metal mixed with blood. Will covered his nose. Something was wrong. The dog sat down near the cave and looked at him again. Will turned on his flashlight and pointed it into the cave. The light revealed the rough walls and the damp floor. He took a careful step forward. As the light moved deeper into the cave, it caught something large. A shape, a figure. Will froze. There, in the middle of the cave, stood a creature. It had long arms and large wings. The skin looked tough and leathery. Its eyes glowed red in the light. The creature was not hiding. It stood tall and still, staring back at him. It looked like the stories, like the old drawings. Will knew what it was. He didn't want to believe it, but it was real. He had found the Jersey Devil. For a moment, neither moved. Then the creature made a sound. A deep, sharp screech that echoed through the cave. Will's heart pounded. He knew he could not fight this thing. He had come to observe, not to battle. Quickly, Will reached into his bag and pulled out a smoke bomb. He had packed it for emergencies. He pulled the pin and threw it to the ground. Thick smoke filled the air. He covered his mouth and turned back. He ran. The dog was gone. The forest looked different now. The trees felt tighter. The path seemed longer. Will kept running, coughing from the smoke and pushing past branches. He did not stop until he reached the edge of the village. He stood there, breathing hard, looking back toward the forest. Everything was quiet again. The stars above had not moved. The houses were still dark. But nothing felt the same. He had seen it. The stories were real. The creature was not a legend. It was alive, and it was watching. Will walked slowly back to his tent. His hands were shaking. His legs felt weak. He sat down on the ground and looked at the forest. He could not sleep now. He could not forget what he had seen. The night was far from over. The night had been long and full of fear. Will Smith had not slept after what he had seen in the cave. The image of the creature stayed in his mind. He knew it was not a dream. He had seen it with his own eyes. He also knew he could not face it alone again. He needed help. He needed proof. He needed people who could back him up. As soon as the sky began to lighten, Will packed his things. He left the village and started walking. He moved quickly, not stopping to rest. It took hours to get back to the town where he had been dropped off earlier. Once there, he found a police station. It was small, but it was open. Will explained what had happened. He left out some details at first. He just said he had found something strange. He said it needed to be checked. The officers looked at him with doubt, but they agreed to come. Will led the way. The group drove as far as the dirt road would take them. After that, they walked. Some of the officers complained, but they kept moving. Will was quiet. He stayed focused. His mind was on the cave. He hoped it was still there. He also hoped the creature was gone. By the time they reached the village, the sun was high. The houses still stood silent. The place looked empty, just as before. The officers spread out, looking around. Will told them to follow him into the forest. He remembered the path well. The trees still looked dark and strange. The air was cooler there. The group moved slowly but without turning back. They reached the cave. The smell was still in the air. It was faint now, but it had not disappeared. Will turned on his flashlight and stepped inside. The others followed, looking around with growing concern. The cave walls were damp. The ground felt uneven under their feet. Then they saw it. At the back of the cave, hidden behind some large rocks, there was a metal door. It did not belong in a cave. It was smooth and silver. It had no handle, only a small black square on the side. The officers stared at it in silence. Will stepped forward. He had not noticed the door the night before. It must have been behind the creature or hidden by shadows. Now, in daylight, it was clear. He reached out and touched the black square. Suddenly, a voice came from the wall. It was cold and robotic. It spoke in English. It said the words slowly and clearly. It said that self-extermination would begin in 10 seconds. Everyone froze. The voice began to count down. 10, 9, 8. The officers shouted and ran for the exit. Will turned and ran too. His flashlight shook in his hand. His heart pounded. The cave echoed with the countdown. 5, 4, 3. They reached the outside. The trees opened up in front of them. Then, a loud boom filled the air. The ground shook. A flash of fire and smoke burst from the cave. Rocks flew in every direction. The noise was sharp and deep. Birds scattered from the trees. The group stopped running once they reached the edge of the village. They turned and looked back. A cloud of black smoke rose from the forest. The cave was gone. The entrance had collapsed. The trees nearby were scorched. The smell of burning filled the air. No one spoke for a long time. The officers looked at Will with wide eyes. They now believed something was wrong. They had seen the door. They had heard the voice. And they had escaped an explosion. Will knew this was no normal cave. Something was being hidden there. And someone had made sure no one would find it. He sat on the ground, breathing hard. His clothes were covered in dirt. His hands were shaking. But his mind was racing. The metal door, the robotic voice, and the explosion all pointed to something larger. Someone had built that place. Someone had placed that creature there. Will now had proof that something dangerous had been kept in that cave. But the answers were still out of reach. The cave was gone, but the questions remained. What was really behind that door? And why was it destroyed the moment they found it? The explosion changed everything. The cave was gone, and with it, any easy way to prove what Will had seen. But he did not stop. If anything, the blast made him more curious. It was not a normal reaction. Someone had built a strong door inside a cave, and when it was touched, a voice warned of self-destruction. That meant someone had something to hide. Will stayed in the area. The police officers had left. They were shaken by what happened and wanted no part in it. Will, however, needed answers. He went back to the edge of the forest and started searching the area around the destroyed cave. Pieces of metal were scattered across the ground. Some parts of the forest were burned. But near the edge of the explosion, he found something unexpected. Hidden under a rock, he spotted a small box. It was black and dented, but not destroyed. It looked like some kind of storage case. He opened it carefully. Inside, there were documents. The papers were old, but readable. Most of them had numbers, codes, and short descriptions. Many pages were marked with a strange symbol he didn't recognize. Will took the documents back to his tent. He spread them out and began reading. The words were simple but strange. Some papers talked about controlled evolution. Others used phrases like cross-species development and secure testing zones. One page listed project names. The one that stood out had the title NJX-13. Beside it, someone had written the word active. He kept reading through the night. The papers pointed to something bigger than he expected. This was not just a local mystery. This was a government project. A secret one. From the names and terms used, it looked like the project had started many years ago. Some documents were dated over 20 years ago. Others were more recent. That meant the work had continued for a long time. One report talked about human-animal hybrids. Another mentioned something about changes in behavior after injections. There were notes on failures too, mentions of test subjects becoming violent or unstable. Will read every word. His heart beat faster with each page. It all started to make sense. The village was not just abandoned. It had been used. The people there may have been moved or taken. Or worse, the creature he had seen, the one that looked like the Jersey Devil, was not a legend. It was likely created in that facility. It had not come from a story. It had come from science. There were notes about a group of scientists and security staff. One page listed rules for entering the test area. Another mentioned emergency lockdowns and automatic destruction in case of breach. That explained the door and the voice. If anyone found it, the system would wipe out the evidence. But they had missed something. The papers had survived. And now Will had them. He wanted to find out more. He returned to the site during the day. He walked through the area where the explosion had happened. Some parts of the cave still showed signs of human work. Burnt wires, broken panels, and melted metal pieces were everywhere. It looked like a lab had been hidden behind the door. A lab deep underground. The more he found, the clearer it became. Someone had been trying to hide their mistakes. The creature was only part of it. The documents showed there had been others. Other experiments. Other places. One page had a line of text that caught Will's attention. It read, "If subject NJX 13 escapes, contact Site B immediately." Site B was underlined. Will didn't know what or where Site B was, but he knew it mattered. Will took pictures of everything. He scanned the documents and saved backups. He wanted to make sure nothing was lost. He also knew he could not trust anyone yet. This was too big, too dangerous. By the end of the day, Will had learned the truth. The Jersey Devil was not a myth. It was not a ghost or a monster from old stories. It was a product of science. A product of people who thought they could control nature and change life itself. But something had gone wrong. Something had escaped. Now Will had the proof. But the truth only raised more questions. What else had they created? Where was Site B? And was the project really shut down, or was it still going? Will Smith spent the next 2 days going through the documents he had found. Most of them were hard to understand. Some had codes instead of names. Others were missing pages. But one thing was clear. The project was not limited to the cave he had visited. There were signs that the operation was much larger. There was more than one location. He made notes and tried to organize what he had. He looked at names, numbers, and places. Most of the documents mentioned Site A, which he now knew was the cave. But a few papers mentioned Site B. These pages were harder to read. Some had burn marks. Others were scratched or faded. Still, Will was able to find something important. One document had a set of coordinates. They were numbers written in small print near the bottom of a page. At first, they didn't seem important. But when Will entered the numbers into his map, they pointed to a location far from the village. It was deep in a mountain region. There were no towns nearby, no roads. The area was surrounded by trees and rocks. It looked untouched. Will kept checking other papers. One listed supplies sent to Site B. It included lab equipment, security systems, and something called containment cells. Another page mentioned that Site B had deeper levels than Site A. It was described as more stable and better protected. That meant it was more important. It could be where the main part of the project had taken place. He found another file. It was badly damaged, but he could still read parts of it. It spoke about subject control logs and emergency shutdown procedures. The top of the page had a label, Site B, Level 3. Will circled the title and placed it beside the map. He now believed Site B was still active, or at least not destroyed like the first one. The deeper he looked, the more questions he had. Why were there multiple sites? How many more were out there? And what was really inside this second location? He needed answers. He also needed to be careful. If the first site had a self-destruction system, the second might be even more dangerous. Will started planning. He listed what he needed. The journey would not be easy. The map showed no clear path to the coordinates. He would have to hike through forests and hills. He would need food, water, and tools. He also needed better protection. He wasn't just dealing with nature. There could be traps, old machines, or worse. He checked the weather and chose the best time to leave. He also checked satellite images. The area near Site B looked strange. One spot had a flat, gray patch that didn't match the land around it. Could be a roof or a hidden door. It was hard to tell, but it was enough to give him hope. Will spent one more night in the village, reading the papers again. He packed the most important ones in a secure bag. He saved digital copies on 2 separate devices. He didn't want to lose anything if something went wrong. Before leaving, he returned to the edge of the forest where the cave had been. The ground was still black from the fire. Smoke no longer rose, but the smell was faintly there. He stood for a moment, thinking about what had happened. The creature, the door, the countdown, all of it had led him to this next step. He turned back and walked to the main road. The path ahead would be longer, but now he had a clear goal. He had the coordinates. He had the documents. He had a reason to keep going. Something was hidden in the mountains, and it was connected to everything he had found. This was no longer about just one creature or one place. It was about something much bigger. The truth was not buried in a single cave. It was spread across locations, protected by silence and fear. Will was ready to break that silence. As he walked away from the village, his mind stayed focused. He was going to Site B. He didn't know what he would find there, but he knew it was the key to everything. Will Smith sat in a small room at the edge of town. It was quiet. He had everything spread out in front of him. Papers, maps, photos, and notes. He looked at them again and again. He had come a long way since hearing the first rumor. Now, he had real proof that something strange was going on. But he knew this was not the end. It was just the beginning of something much bigger. The documents he found pointed to another hidden place. It was deep in the mountains, far from any city or road. The files called it Site B. It seemed to be larger and more important than the first one. The area looked quiet on maps, but Will knew that silence could hide dark secrets. He had to go there, but this time he needed to be ready for anything. He made a list of what he would need. He packed light but smart. He added more tools than before. A new flashlight, batteries, waterproof bags, climbing rope, and stronger boots. He brought more food and water this time. He also packed a camera with night vision. He wanted to capture everything, no matter the time or light. He bought a stronger backpack and tested all his gear. He charged his devices and saved backup copies of all the documents. He stored them on 2 different drives and placed them in different bags. He didn't want to lose anything again. He also wrote a full report. He explained what he had seen and what he had found. He added photos of the destroyed cave, the papers, and the map showing the second location. He didn't name the village or give exact coordinates, but he made sure the report could guide someone else if needed. He recorded a video. He looked straight into the camera and spoke clearly. He told people he had found something strange. He said he was going to a second location. He didn't give too many details, but he said this journey might reveal the full truth. He warned viewers that what he was doing was dangerous. He said he hoped someone would hear him, understand him, and be ready for what might come. After recording, he uploaded the video to a secure site and sent the report to a few trusted contacts. He didn't want to cause fear, but he knew he couldn't stay quiet. People had a right to know something was wrong. Once everything was done, he double-checked his backpack. He tightened the straps and zipped up the bags. He folded the map and placed it in a safe spot. Then he stood up and looked out the window. The sky was gray. The wind moved the trees. The mountains waited in the distance. He left the town early the next morning. He didn't speak to anyone. He moved quickly and kept his head down. He found a bus that could take him close to the mountain area. From there, he would walk the rest of the way. It would take time, maybe days, but he was ready for it. Will walked with purpose. He knew what he had seen. He knew what he had read. The project was real. The creature was real. And Site B might hold more answers or more danger. As he moved farther away from town, the roads became smaller. The signs disappeared. The land turned rough and wild. The deeper he went, the fewer people he saw. At some point, he stopped seeing anyone at all. It was just him and the path ahead. He kept thinking about what he might find. Another door? Another cave? More creatures? He didn't know, but he would not turn back. He had come too far. He had risked too much. This was his mission now. Not just as a private investigator, but as someone who had seen the truth and could not look away. Each step brought him closer to the unknown. The place ahead was not on any map, but it was real. It had been built for a reason, and now he was going to find out why. Will did not stop. The world behind him faded. The forest grew thick around him. The mountains stood tall in the distance. He was alone but not afraid. Whatever waited at Site B, he would face it, and he would tell the world.